Okay, we'll get started here in about a minute or two. Okay, well, I get started. Welcome to the second annual New Mobility Study sponsored by Vision Mobility and Curiosity CX. I'm Dave Fish. We'll have about a 45-minute to 50-minute presentation today. As the title indicates, this is in fact the second annual study on this. Some details, we are recording this session, so if you have colleagues that want to see this or you want to reference it later, it will be available. We're still working on a place to put it, but we'll put it out there. And we also, the slides themselves will be available as well a day or so after this presentation, and you're free to use them. The only thing that we ask is that you do reference that if you're using it in a presentation of your own, and cite the work in there, and give us attribution. In the webinar itself today, if you have any questions, we're going to hold them to the end. But you can chat, use the chat functionality here to ask questions along the way. So if you could remain muted throughout the presentation, that would be helpful, so we can avoid background noise and so forth. And then we'll unmute everyone right at the end, and we'll do a little Q&A. That sounds good. Okay. As far as I'm concerned, I'm Dave Fish. I'll be one of the co-presenters today. I'm founder of Curiosity CX. I worked at Toyota, Merritt's, JD Power, shopper marketing agency here in Bentonville, and many other areas. And I really focused in on the human aspect of how people make decisions, why they do the things they do. And as we talk about new mobility, there is a huge psychological component. As many folks are technologists or engineers, it's easy to forget that aspect, that humans are not always the most rational of people, of creatures, I guess, and understanding why they do what they do is really important to, and can really determine the success of these different emerging technologies. Not always the best technology wins. It's the technology that's most understood and people see the most utility in that tends to win out in the end. And I'm joined here by James. James, you want to do a little intro?
Hi, Dave. Yeah. Thanks. Welcome everyone to our second annual mobility study now. And my name's James, and I was working for Toyota for nearly 20 years. And a couple of years ago, I left Toyota to go out on my own and take a dip in this world of what this new idea of new mobility looks like. So our business focuses on insights to OEMs, dealers, tier ones, and startups. And, I'm a car guy. I really enjoy looking at what the car landscape looks like. And I think we're in for some really big changes over the next few years.
Great. And then we also are joined by Jason Schweitzer. And Jason, you just want to do a little intro?
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. Morning, everybody. My name is Jason, as Dave said. I'm a student at Michigan State University, and I'm pursuing my Master's of Science in Marketing Research. So I got into this because I really love marketing research, and specifically automotive research. And when I had an opportunity to work with Dave and James, I absolutely jumped at the chance. Prior to joining these two gentlemen, I worked as an attorney for 7.5 years before starting my master's program and doing a short stint at FCA and another market research firm called Darker Worldwide.
Great. Thanks, Jason. All right, so let's jump into it. Our goals today are the same goals we had previously. First, understand what are people's thoughts and feelings around new mobility options. What do they want and need in this technology? What are they open to? What are they not open to? What are those barriers that are out there? What are people fearful about? And how, maybe a glimpse of how we might overcome some of those fears and navigate some of those barriers. And then finally, we have a section on new mobility and looking at some new possibilities. How about going about doing the research is we had three main three main inputs, I guess. One is the primary research, which I'll talk about in a minute. Secondary research, which is basically going out to websites of all things libraries, or actually just observation and just kind of soaking up what's out there. The landscape is changing very rapidly. James and I did this last year, and since then there's been almost whole new categories, especially around subscription services, that really has bloomed and taken off and really fragmented. So it's been exciting to see and watch and read about. And then the last is, James and I have spent, the better part of 40, 50 years, and you throw Jason in there, and I don't know, you're probably approaching around a century maybe of automotive background and thinking and being in the industry, both on the retail and product planning, marketing sides of the equation. So that thinking component is always important. We're not about dumping data on you. We actually want to provide some context and some insight today. So as far as the primary research, we tried to keep the fielding the same. It is a U.S. study, but a lot of these trends in the U.S. are translatable, certainly into Canada and globally as well. Our first wave was in September through October. We tried to keep the same horizon. It's a national rep sample, so anyone 18. I think our oldest respondent was around 86, but we do weight that back to the national pop. So it is projectable within 1 or 2 percentage points of error, or I should say 2 or 3 percentage points of error across the United States. So any percentage you see here today, you could probably say 2-3 percentage points of error around that, but it's a pretty robust and rigorous study. We tried to make it short because we wanted to make sure we had good respondents and high quality respondents. And so these, 20-page surveys that no one wants to fill out, and the people who do fill out your question, we try to keep it short and to the point. And like I mentioned, we did weight the data. As far as the sections we're going to cover today, 5 main sections. One is around new mobility landscape. The second is around knowledge and adoption of this technology. We'll take a look at consumer sentiment a bit, and then new mobility interest. And then we have a special section called fear of an autonomous planet. So we're really looking to almost some counterintuitive findings, which we'll put into some context around autonomous vehicles. So a really cool set of findings throughout the presentation today, but we thought we might open it by providing some context about what's going on in new mobility. A lot of folks on the phone are obviously up on it, but you might be familiar with your little slice of the pie. So I thought perhaps having an overview of the landscape itself might be helpful. So I'll turn it over to James to take it from here. And let me give you control, James. There you go.
Great. Thanks, Dave. So firstly, we wanted to start with, at least by just giving some definitions, just so we're all on the same page of what we're talking about here. So we talk about car sharing. I guess in this context, car sharing 1.0 is companies like Zipcar or Hertz On Demand, or there's Enterprise as well has car sharing service, and these are generally what you'd call station-based car sharing, i.e. you have to drive from a point to point. Car sharing 2.0, by contrast, is what people call free floating, i.e. you can drop it anywhere, drop it off almost anywhere, and people can come and pick it up. As long as the parking regulations let you, then you can drop it off. Car sharing 3.0 is what we'd call person-to-person car sharing, i.e. Personally, I have a Subaru WRX. If I could put that on something like Truro or others, and someone could come and rent that car for a day. The next one here is ride-hailing. Ride-hailing is simply Uber or Lyft, or in other countries like Get. Shared ride-hailing is Uber Pool or Lyft Line. And microtransit is things like Chariot or Via, which enables buses to not necessarily stay to the same route, but pick up people and drop people off where there's demand. There's one last one that is not on here, but I think is worth mentioning because we will touch on it, and that's ride sharing. Ride sharing we would define as carpooling in a more traditional terminology. Now, moving on, all this growth in these new ideas such as car sharing, ride hailing and others, there's projections out there, and this one is from Loop Ventures, that shows significant increase in fleet units over time. From today, around just under 10% through to 65% in 2040, according to this research here. And you can see this steady growth of fleet units as things like subscription, ride hailing, car sharing, all those other things come together, but it really takes off when autonomy, and you can see that inflection point about 2032, and that's the point, according to this research, about when autonomy really starts to get going. Another thing that we should define here is what exactly is autonomous vehicles. So there's 6 stages here, 0 through to 5. 0 being no automation whatsoever, and this could be your 1960 Chevrolet Bel Air or whatever you happen to choose. Level 1 is something on the vehicle has some sort of assistance. This could be cruise control. This could be lane keeping assist. This could be ABS. So some sort of singularly active device that helps the driver. However, what happens when you jump to level 2 is that these systems start to work together. For instance, to create the Tesla autopilot system, we have radar cruise control start to work with lane keeping assist to create the steering function, plus other things as well. When we jump to level 3, there's one big difference, and that's at some stage that the driver can actually switch off. They don't have to pay attention at some points during their driving experience. Level 0 to level 2, the driver must always pay attention. And this is what's called conditional automation. Level 4 and level 5 is where it gets really interesting. And level 4 basically says it's fully autonomous within a set mapped area, i.e. within these places that this vehicle can be driven, it's fully autonomous, there's no need for a driver, the vehicle takes care of itself. The difference with level 5 is that that vehicle can travel anywhere under full autonomy. Now here's some projections, one from ABI Research and the other again from Loop Ventures, is that we can see this strong growth in autonomous vehicles over the next 20 plus years. And I think it's very interesting in the first one where around 2025 or 2026, we actually start to see a decrease in level 2 as all vehicles tend towards either a level 4 or a level 5 type fully autonomous arrangement. And you can see in the second graph from Loop Ventures around the 2030 mark just how quickly the amount of level 1 vehicles out there really drops off. And by 2040, how almost all vehicles will be level 4 or level 5 autonomous. Another thing we've just observed just recently is the introduction of the Tesla electric truck, which was being shown for introduction probably late next year. I think this is one representative sample of much change in new technology that's out there, whether it's in cars or whether it's in trucks or other forms of transportation. There is so much new technology coming to market. There's so much development in electric technology, particularly as battery technology improves. And this technology, combining with some of the other social aspects, is really going to be a huge driver in the future of our transportation. So this leads us to a question. The mobility bubble, what is it? What does that mean? Well, I think one of the things that we've found is that this idea of personal mobility could be in for a big change. If we have a look at this graph here, since 1969, say 48 years ago, we've seen that the growth in vehicles in the United States has dramatically outpaced the growth in drivers, workers, households, and persons. So in fact, you could say that the growth in vehicles has actually more than tripled the growth in population. And when you think about it, that potentially could be worrying. Is there a bubble? Do we have too many vehicles out there? So the question is, what happens to the car market in the future? Well, this report from Morgan Stanley, this forecast here, shows that actually year-on-year increases in vehicle production are actually going to slow down to 2025. And from then on, there's going to be no growth at all beyond that as shared cars on the road actually increases. There's certainly schools of thought that beyond 2030, that vehicle production will actually start to fall as those shared cars increases beyond, say, the 15% shown here to, say, 30, 40, 50%. So right now, after this introduction, I'm going to hand it back to Dave, and he's going to go through some mobility knowledge and adoption that we've found through our study. Thanks, Dave.
All right, thanks, James. Let's move to the mobility knowledge and adoption. So we're in our primary study, we're able to identify some trends over time. Now we have 2 points of time, but I guess that composes a trend. And what we saw, first thing we asked folks is, what's your knowledge about hold on one second here. What's your knowledge about different mobility options? So we ask about local, if you had to explain this service to a friend or a relative, what would you say? Or would you be able to, basically? And you can see local public transit, long distance public, airlines, and so forth. So there's some baseline stuff in there, and it makes sense. Like, most people can explain how to book travel on an airline. And you see to the right are some more esoteric and emerging services, such as shared vehicle services or peer-to-peer, and especially autonomous. One thing you see here, though, of interest is a slight increase in knowledge around ride sharing. And so if we move forward and actually look at usage over the last 3 months, we can see some interesting findings here. We see some shifts, no real shifts in local public transit, but we do see dips in long distance public transit using cab service and rental car. And then you see offsetting that is ride sharing services such as Lyft and Uber. So in a lot of the press, you're seeing the impact it has on different verticals. And in fact, these are the 3 that have been mentioned. We're a little bit surprised to learn about long distance public transportation, but actually another study from UC Davis came out, and we'll look at that in a little bit too as well, that basically validates that finding that some folks are taking ride sharing in lieu of long distance public transit and even local transit. That's some of their conclusions. Not in droves, but it is impacting because it's cheaper and more convenient for folks. The impact on the taxi vertical is much more pronounced. This is a chart from ToddSchneider.com, and he's able to gather up data on daily trips of, in this case, New York City, of cabs, Uber, and Lyft. And this is actual behavioral data. And you can see here since January of 15, that yellow line goes down. And the blue line, which is trips in Uber, and the pink, which is Lyft, go up. And you see in about July, if not before, the combined ride-hailing of Lyft and Uber overtook them in probably January. By July, Uber itself was outpacing yellow taxi within New York City. So definitely some disruption. And if you ever go to New York City, the Ubers are not that much less inexpensive. In fact, sometimes can be more expensive than yellow cab. But what we're going to see is people just prefer the service because of the convenience of it. And what they've done is taken a lot of the unpleasantness out of the taxi in terms of the driver itself, the condition of the vehicle, the ease of hailing, and re-engineered that into this ride-hailing approach. And this, we asked folks 4 different questions comparing these different modes of transportation and which one was better or worse. And you can see there on the left, unfortunately, for taxi companies at least, they're rated the lowest across the board. They were seen as unsafe, not particularly convenient, not at all cost-effective, and the overall experience was kind of lousy. And if we move right, you can see higher marks, although not hitting it out of the park on Lyft and Uber, but doing better, especially on convenience and the cost effectiveness and the overall experience, doing better on those dimensions. Not surprising, a limousine is seen as quite safe and a good experience, but fairly costly. And then carpooling, people see it as pretty expensive, or pretty cost effective, excuse me, but perhaps not as convenient for them because you have to deal with, coordinating with others. Even there's technology that makes that a bit easier nowadays. And public transit seen as very cost effective, but not particularly convenient, and really not, at least in the United States, a good experience if you travel or if you're in other countries and you've experienced our public transit versus other countries. We don't typically rate as well in general. And then people like their cars. American car culture has it that the people really like the convenience. They don't, when they see that cost effectiveness, it's a kind of a head scratcher for us. But I think, again, that psychology comes in where people don't view cost of ownership as insurance and maintenance and all the things that have to go with owning a car. They think about the payment, the monthly payment. And when we get farther in the presentation, we'll see evidence of that again. So the implications for this is if we're communicating these new forms of transportation, to be clear that we're comparing things apples to apples and communicating effectively around total cost of ownership as well. So let's take a look into consumer sentiment here a bit and how people view new mobility. One of the things we found from our last study last year was, in fact, about 1 in 3 Americans agreed with the statement, if I didn't have to own a car, I wouldn't. So that's a lot of people, because we have probably close to 260 million people in the United States who are of driving age and drive, and 1 in 3 of them are saying, yeah, I could do without that. And that's been pretty stable. In 2016, that was about 35%, and this year it's 36%. So a non-significant change, but something underlying sentiment that we should pay attention to. And in general, we see an impact from a cohort standpoint. So the younger you are, the less interested you are in car ownership. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. We'll get into that in a moment. But the younger generation is just not as interested in car ownership. And if we look at different other profiles on car ownership, it's the young urbanites are most ready to be free. And this has also been validated by another study done by Zipcar, actually, which we'll look at in a minute. But you can see here, the national average is around 36%. If you live in an urban area, you're likely, half of those folks are saying, if I didn't have to own a car, I wouldn't. It's a hassle. You have to find parking. You have to pay for parking. The traffic is horrendous, and so it's just not a very pleasant experience. If you don't have children, that tends to also push it up. So if you have children at home, you don't want to, probably if they're sick or have the flu or there's an emergency, every second counts. And so you probably don't want to have trade off your child's safety or perceived safety, at least. You want to have that car in your garage or in the parking space so you can get them to where they need to be and have that flexibility. And also there's a lot of stuff they have to go to as well. So that flexibility is important. Being young is also a driver. So you can see those under the age of 26, that's a big ticket item for young folks to buy. And so they probably rather spend it on something else. So young, urban, childless are the folks. And this is the study from Zipcar. They've done an annual study, and this year, actually in 16, or last year, they actually gave up on even talking to people across the U.S. because they found that most of their users are, in fact, in urban areas. And so now they just talk to urbanites. And they found that about half of the folks who live in urban areas either don't own a car or they don't drive it every day. So 23% of folks who live in urban areas own a car but don't use it every day. About 10% don't own a car but wish they did. Another 9% said, I don't own a car and I don't need one. And then 9% don't have a license and presumably don't have a car either. So a growing trend in those urban areas. But I think the thing to keep in mind is just because you don't want to own a car doesn't mean you don't like that you don't enjoy driving. So you could see 45 to 54 there. This is men and women. Men are in blue, women are in that kind of orange color. I'm in my 40s, and I really do enjoy driving quite a bit. Like most of my cohorts, having grown up on Smokey and the Bandit and Dukes of Hazzard and all those great shows, those car shows, and so I do enjoy driving. But maybe, about 1 in 3 of my generation, at least, are saying, if I didn't have to own that car and have all the hassle and the payment of owning it, that's okay. I'd be okay with that. So the point here is the love affair with driving is still fairly strong, although you see some softness in the 18 to 24-year-old bracket. But by and large, Americans like driving. They don't like sitting in traffic. They like driving. But the appeal of ownership is declining. And so some of these new mobility schemes, such as subscription services and partial ownership, gives folks the ability to have that experience of driving and enjoy it without the hassle of ownership. We're also seeing that there's a trend, a zeitgeist, if you will, around just ownership in general. And so about 1 in 4 Americans said, in general, I'd rather rent or lease expensive things than own them. So just getting rid of stuff. People are moving out of their bigger houses into smaller houses in a lot of cases, and just trying to divest themselves of expensive things if they can, but still get the benefits. And if we look again at who has the sentiment, you can see folks, in rural and country areas, ownership of things are important because there's probably a bit more scarcity and not as much capability of sharing things. But as you get to larger cities and small suburbs and even larger cities, this idea of not owning things because you are living in a small apartment perhaps, and just not having a lot of stuff. Stuff is a kind of a burden. And so a lot of those folks are saying, hey, I don't need that. If you live in an urban area or if you're highly educated, grad school, you tend not to like stuff as much. And a little bit of a bump there for males as well, wanting to kind of rid themselves of expensive things, but just rent or lease them rather than necessarily own them. So it gets you asking why that's the case. Well, there's a couple things driving this. One are just pure economic forces. In the United States, home prices have gone up 30% since 2010. Rent's gone up 20%, but hourly earnings have not kept pace. So, that's the squeeze, right? Likewise, millennials are not buying homes. And again, this is partially economic, but it's also partially just a social trend. Folks are also delaying everything. They're delaying getting married, they're delaying going to school, they're delaying getting their driver's license, and they're delaying moving out of the house. And so folks are just not as interested, especially the younger generation, in owning things or pursuing those expensive things. And the other thing that's driving this are social forces. And so one is the advent of the sharing economy. As you get experience with these different forms of ownership or partial ownership or rental ownership, I guess, sharing, such as Spotify, Airbnb, Uber, Just Park, Fiverr, all these things where you're not buying the cow, you're just buying the milk 1 cup at a time. And there was a time when people would get freaked out if they didn't own their music, they didn't own that album, or they didn't own that MP4 file. Now we just stream it from Spotify. It's going to be there, and that's cool. And people are much more comfortable with that. And the more you're exposed to these, the more you get it, and the more you can. That mindset can be transitioned to other categories such as automotive. And the other thing is, we're in general, if you read any of the popular press or any research whatsoever, this idea of having experiences versus owning stuff. And so the boomer generation, having a house and owning that BMW perhaps, or Mercedes or luxury vehicle Cadillac, was that symbolized you made it. For the younger generation, it is much more about going to a hike in Patagonia, or going to Machu Picchu, or zip lining in Zimbabwe, or what have you. It's about the experiences that you have, and the experiences you have that you can share with friends. And so those are the things that are memorable. Those are the things that are important. It's not owning stuff. It's what the stuff can give you. So the question is, are people ditching their cars as ride-hailing increases? And this is the study I was talking about from Clello and Mishra, just released in October. And this is from the UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies. And what they did is they looked at, among other things, frequency of ride-hail use, and then they asked what happened for your car. And you could see the more people use ride-hailing, the more likely they're to change their behaviors and start either using their vehicle less or getting rid of their car completely. Now, we tend to think about disruption as like an overnight change, but it doesn't happen that way. It happens the more you use something, in this case ride hailing, it starts to slowly displace your household fleet. So you might move, you have two cars and you start using one a little less as you use more ride hailing, and then maybe you just get rid of one car and you have one in the garage and you're using ride hailing for other purposes, and then maybe you're using that one car a little bit less because you find it so convenient. So that's what we're seeing here in this graph as well, in this study done by the UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies. And so the question is, will car ownership go the way of horses? And so this is a graph that Michael Cohen found writing on his blog, Quartz Media. He looked at the population of horses during U.S. industrialization. And so this is when the horse and buggy was literally getting displaced by the car. And you can see precipitous decline and then a little uptick there at the end. And so that's curious, right? So why is that? Well, the horses became the province of the rich. And so there might be a future whereby most of the public in the United States are using some combination of new mobility and traditional mass transit, and only the very wealthy might own vehicles in the future. It's a possibility. As far as the retail experience, it's no secret that that's an area of opportunity for the industry. This is from Auto Trader's Car Buyer, the Future study conducted last year. About 1% said, hey, don't change anything about the car buying experience. It's terrific right now. So that means 99 of the folks in the United States at least say there's some improvement needed. And even very influential people in the industry that are in the business of selling vehicles feel the same. This is Mike Jackson, CEO of AutoNation. When it comes to autos, the auto industry, they feel like they have gone back a decade in time. We think there will be a great disruption in auto retailing, and I think James and Jason and I all feel the same. And if you think about the number of dealerships out there, there are 17,540 auto dealerships. There's only 4,672 Walmarts. Both offer a lot of different products. The difference being is you typically have to go to the grocery store or the department store once a week. You have to go to an auto dealership every 3 to 5 years, or maybe every 6 to 12 months to get serviced if that's where you service your vehicle. So I would probably venture to put out there that we are probably over-networked when it comes to the dealerships, and we're going to see some significant consolidation and continued consolidation in the industry. It's not efficient when 90% of Americans are within 10 minutes of a Walmart. You could just imagine how close everyone is to an auto dealership, and we really don't need that. So increasingly, in response to that experience, folks are looking to get the best deal possible because of what goes on in the car buying experience. 75% of Americans try to get the best deal possible. And 3 in 4, and this is a study from Accenture, 3 in 4 folks said if given the opportunity, they would prefer making the entire car buying process online, from financing all the way to delivery. We know today, with the exception of Tesla, that is not possible, and even Tesla in many states can't do it because of dealer franchise laws. But this is consumer preference, and when consumers want things a certain way, and they like it a certain way, and they're used to Amazon Prime and getting that delivery within a day and a half or less to their doorstep, that's going to put significant pressure on retailers, auto retailers, and how they're going to have to respond. And consumers are finding workarounds. And so this is, Meritz did a study in 2015 and asked the study, when I shop for a new vehicle, I first contact their internet sales department. Well, we replicated that question with the same population 2 years later. And we can see here, nothing's really changed. Folks, about half of Gen Zs and millennials start by RFPing for a vehicle. So they contact the internet sales department or several of them and get the best price. And then when they have a deal in hand, then and only then do they go down to the dealership. And so people are finding ways around dealing with the dealership. And so we're going to see significant changes mostly coming from consumerism, that's going to change, in technology, that's going to change how vehicles are bought and serviced. And we're already seeing some of those emerge in the marketplace today. And Tesla, I think, is a great example of a way of re-engineering the dealership experience as well as the vehicle itself. So with that, let's turn it over to James, and he'll walk us through new mobility interest and what's some of the consumer interest in some of these technologies. So James. Oops, it'd be helpful if I take you off mute, wouldn't it? Sorry.
There we go. How's that?
That's perfect. That's perfect.
So yeah, thanks very much, Dave. So what we've done, just scrolling back one here, our computer's a little slow.
Let me help you out.
Thanks, mate. Just go back to slide, I think, 52. So one of the first things that we see here is we decided to compare from last year to this year, what's people's mobility interest in new ideas in mobility. So you can see the first three there being carpooling. Carpooling with a friend, carpooling with a stranger for no fee, and carpooling with a stranger with fee, renting someone else's car, a partial vehicle ownership, and the last one there using other people's cars. So what we see in general is that everything's pretty much about the same as last year. The findings that we found last year, people are pretty similar. The main thing that we see that's different is that carpooling itself with strangers is going down. And we're going to go into this a little bit more in a minute. But that is the main thing that we see that's different. When we have a look at having a look at those same ideas, is that we decided to overlay commute time to see if there's any difference. And what we found, as soon as people have any sort of commute time, the interest in new mobility ideas such as carpooling, renting, partial ownership, etc., goes up significantly compared to those who have very small commute times. So in the future, as we look at things like subscription, as we look at things like shared ownership, it's the people who have long commute times that are going to put their hands up first. These are the target markets. We compared last year versus this year, and you can see the 2016 benchmark going through there. And the first thing that you'll notice is those who had short commutes actually had lower interest this year, while people who had any sort of commute time, even if it was just 5 minutes or more, had much higher interest in these ideas. So again, we're seeing the same amount or higher of interest in people with commute times wanting these new mobility type ideas, while people who have low commute times aren't as interested. Another thing we did was we overlaid commute times on stress. And what we found was that as soon as you have any sort of commute time, even longer than 6 minutes, the stress levels increase significantly, and you can see those numbers going up. What was also really interesting was particularly just how high stress levels are in urban commutes. Even for short commutes, these levels are very high. In fact, people who had 6 to 25 minutes commutes said 49% of them said they were stressed if they lived in urban areas. So again, urban commuters are the ones who are going to be the primary targets for new mobility ideas. Another thing here that we looked at is that we measured people's priorities in their mobility. So we could also measure this over age, over different ages and different generations. First thing we found that as people got older, the more interested they were in reducing the cost of use of their transportation. However, as they got older, the priority on increase of speed to destination and ability to be productive while on that transportation actually falls. So that's something that's really interesting in our book, is that people who are younger prioritize increased speed to destination and ability to be productive. So let's have a look what happened year on year. In 2017, we found two things that happened. One was that plurals, or young people, actually reduced their interest in cost of use, while people who are millennials and Gen X actually increased their desire in increased speed to their destination. One of the things we measured here was we wanted to have a look at ease of use of transportation. We see lots of new ideas in transportation like Uber or City Mapper or Mass type applications, but we were wondering just how easy are these things to use? And what we saw was that the older people got, the more they valued ease of use. And that makes sense. I know how many of you out there who have, elderly parents or grandparents who don't even know what a computer is. They don't know how to text or use a smartphone or, other new technologies as well. And this just as much applies to transportation as well. And the ease of use for older people is extremely important. And what we found year on year into 2017 is that this actually got much stronger. There's a much higher emphasis on ease of use for transportation for older people. And we believe as new mobility moves forward, and that one of the primary targets for autonomous vehicles is the ability to offer increased transportation services to the elderly, this is where the ease of use part will become extremely important. As Dave mentioned earlier in the presentation, subscription has become one of the hot topics surrounding automotive at the moment. So we wanted to have a much deeper look into it. We've seen Book by Cadillac being introduced, as well as others such as we've seen others such as Porsche Passport. We've seen Wagon X. We've seen Flex Drive, Clutch, a whole bunch of others just come into this environment. And also there's others that are similar but not quite the same, such as Fair. And this growth in these new ideas of almost short-term ownership are really blurring the lines of what we would traditionally see in the gap between rental and leasing, or rental and financing that vehicle that you traditionally buy. So we decided to ask people some questions. Imagine an annual subscription service where you could select the right vehicle for the right purpose any day of the week. And also imagine that the cost for this service would be roughly equal to the total cost of owning a $30,000 vehicle, i.e. annual payments, insurance, maintenance, taxes, etc. So what were the results? We found that 25% of Americans would choose to subscribe to a vehicle subscription service than own their own vehicle. So if you can imagine how many hundreds of millions of vehicles are on the US road right now, 25% would actually say, no, I don't want it. I'd rather subscribe to a subscription service. And then we found around another 20% said they were undecided. They weren't sure whether they would want to own or go in the subscription route. In other words, they're open to change, i.e. we're talking almost 50% of the American population are either open or they are quite likely to move to subscription. And this is a really, really high number in our book. And this also means there's tons of opportunity. So what about the different types of people who favored subscription? So we found three things that were really important. One was that if people lived in a large city or urban area, had a graduate degree, and had a high income, then they were much more likely to want to do vehicle subscriptions instead of owning. And you can see those increases as the income levels get higher there. So in other words, one of the prime targets for future mobility ideas will be urban areas plus high income plus well-educated people. Last year, we had a very close look at ride sharing, and this year we wanted to follow up some of the results because some of the trends here are extremely important in the way people look at sharing in the sharing economy. So we asked a question, would you be interested in ride sharing? Firstly, with a friend for no fee, and then with a stranger for no fee. What we found last year was that 65% of people said, yep, I'm definitely interested in ride sharing with a friend. However, if they said it was with a stranger, that dropped to below 25% who said they were interested. Conversely, if we look at those people who said they were not at all interested, those who said they were not at all interested in ride sharing with a friend was just over 20%. But when it came to ride sharing with a stranger, that jumped up dramatically to well over 50%. So what happened this year? We saw overall that fewer people were interested in ride sharing, and many more people were not at all interested in ride sharing. So we started to think about this a bit more. Well, what does this mean? Why are people less interested in ride sharing versus last year? One of the things that we found last year was that women are far more likely to say, I'm not at all interested in ride sharing with strangers than men. Just over 35% with men to around 52% with women. And for 2017, both increased dramatically. Both men and women said they were less interested in ride sharing with strangers. So I think we need to understand that as new mobility moves forwards, there's going to be this desire to keep our transportation in some ways personal. In other words, maybe it's these small type of vehicles that perhaps are some of the best ideas for commuting, instead of jamming people all into the same car where they feel uncomfortable with other people that they don't know. And one of the things that we think is that particularly surrounding us, being in a confined space like a vehicle is one of the areas that's really going to be challenging. Perhaps with public transport or buses, which people share every day, those much more open spaces makes people feel much safer. But confined is much more difficult. We wanted to find out what different people thought about the ideas of perhaps owning or even subscribing to vehicles such as that were hybrid, electric, or had autonomous capability, whether that be full or partial. And as you can see, it's the millennials and to a lesser extent, the Gen Xers who are really interested in adopting these new types of technologies. And as we went towards boomers, it falls off quite dramatically. When we had a look at 2017, we actually saw a significant increase in the interest of late Gen X and boomers in things like hybrid vehicles, electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles. And we really think that it's almost an awareness thing, that technology is becoming aware and that people who are older are starting to understand, well, you know what, this is beneficial towards us. Okay, so that's our new mobility interest. I'm going to hand over to Jason now, and he's going to take us through the fear of an autonomous planet.
Thanks, James. Okay. So, Dave?
Yeah, you should have.
I'm actually going to let you control it because I think it ends up being faster that way.
Okay.
So why don't we head over to the next slide? Yeah, and I'm hearing an echo too.
I'll mute everyone and then unmute one.
So everybody, what you're looking at right now is a slide where we asked everybody about how they felt about autonomous vehicles from a safety perspective. And what we learned was that the US population still has quite a concern about the safety of autonomous vehicles. There hasn't been a huge change from last year, but the point is still worth mentioning. You know, while everyone is rushing towards autonomous vehicles, there still is a lot of trepidation about them. And, you know, we wonder, why is that? Well, you know, in 2016, Google had their self-driving Lexus, which is involved in a slow-speed crash. I think the big one that a lot of people, heard about, which made the news, at least in the United States, was a Tesla driver which was killed in May 2016 while using the autopilot feature. Granted, that isn't a fully autonomous vehicle, but because we're in the nascent stage here, that's kind of how the press views it, and that's I think how the general population is seeing things. And even as recently as March of this year, Uber had to suspend their self-driving car program in Tempe, Arizona, after one of its self-driving Volvos was involved in a high-impact crash. So when you see news stories like that, coupled with the fact that a lot of people haven't had personal experience with autonomous vehicles, I think that heightens people's apprehension of the technology, at least currently. So, what do we make of this? If we take a look here, what we'll see is the general population, around 82% have demonstrated that they agree or completely agree with the statement that they're concerned about the safety of autonomous vehicles. And that's pretty true across the board here. But where do we see the outliers? Well, the outliers are those who are under age 25 and those who are over age 60. And I think a lot of people won't be surprised by this data. Those who are under 25 are young people. They're typically the first to adopt new technology and much less reticent, whereas those who are older may take more effort. It might take more effort to convince them of the benefits of this new technology. So the interesting thing about this is a lot of these insights here are hopefully things that you haven't heard before, but if you had, I still think there's a lot of benefit to talking about this. And just like anything, people ask, why pay attention to history? Because you can learn so much from history, right? So in this case, what are we learning from? We're learning from Mr. Otis, who demonstrated the safety and providing perception of control when he introduced the elevator. So back in 1852, we're going way back, in the New York World's Fair, he introduced the elevator. Just like autonomous vehicles, the whole goal of this was to, provide an improvement for everybody's lives. It's going to make everybody's way easier to transport people and goods up and down flights of stairs. It should be a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you want this? Well, because what they found was people don't want it because there's a mistrust of giving control over to a machine. So eventually, Otis realized this and said, okay, we need to do something about this. How can we alleviate this fear? Well, initially what they did was they installed human operators. Well, what's the benefit of that? Well, the benefit is obviously now you're no longer, if something goes wrong, or even if you have a fear of something going wrong, at least you can point to a human being and not to a machine, which people are much less likely to forgive. On top of that, if you look at the image on the left, that's an image of Otis demonstrating the elevator. And what he did was he actually cut safety lines that everyone thought was suspending the elevator to demonstrate that the elevator wouldn't just fall down and he wouldn't fall to his death. Why did we choose this image? Well, we believe that in the future, whoever's going to be making autonomous vehicles, whether it be new mobility disruptors or it's going to be the established OEMs, they're going to have to take steps, to really make it known that, yeah, these are safe and that you can feel comfortable with this. Right now, I guess the big thing to take away is a lot of money is being spent at the moment driving towards this future, I mean, no pun intended here, of an autonomous future. We see it all the time and we hear about it every day. But the question is, are people really taking the time to consider how well are this new technology, is it going to be adopted? I think it would behoove companies to at least hold back a little bit of their budget to maybe meet with some consumer behaviorists and make sure they can figure out a way to communicate that these vehicles are going to be safe, so that way they can actually be widely adopted. So with that being said, we found out that people, as I just discussed, are kind of concerned or have some fear or apprehension about autonomous vehicles. But we know this is coming. So we thought it'd be fun to at least get an idea of what do we think people are willing to pay for this service. We anticipate that, at least initially, people aren't going to be purchasing autonomous vehicles. The technology, just like any new technology, is going to be prohibitively expensive. So we anticipate it rolling out into something more like a ride-hailing service. Well, it's very difficult to ask people how much you're going to pay for something that you've never used or haven't even seen before. But sometimes it's best to use something like a proxy. So in this case, we thought of asking people about how much they would be willing to pay if a fee for a chauffeur to drive you around town, which is essentially what an autonomous vehicle would do, at least initially. So in order to kind of come up with values, we had to ask 4 questions. And those questions are what you see on the screen. How much, at what price do you think it would be too expensive to use? Or expensive, but you might use it? At what price do you think it would be a bargain? Or what price do you think it would be too cheap to be any good? So what we found was actually somewhat surprising. At this point in time, the average monthly payment of a new vehicle, at least according to Experian, is $506 a month. That's what the cost is for a new vehicle in America. Well, when we conducted our analysis and asked those 4 questions previously, what it allowed us to do is find out what is the minimum that people would be willing to pay and the maximum, and what do we think is the optimal price. What we found was the optimal price was $115 a month, which is roughly 1/5 the cost of a new car payment. So why is that? Well, we're going to find out, I think, in these next few slides. What we then did was we said, okay, look, that seems awfully low. What if we layer on top of that people who have knowledge, for example, of things like ride-hailing, because like I said, that's somewhat of a proxy. That's what we expect to be in the future. And what we saw was the price inched up a little bit. So knowledge, obviously, what we're learning here is a necessary component for people to derive value for something like this new technology. And if we took it one step further, Dave?
Yep.
Thank you. One step further, we asked people, for people who've actually used a ride-hailing service within the last 3 months, how much would you be willing to pay? And once again, we see the value steadily increasing. Now, it's still a far cry from the $506. At this point, now we have people who are knowledgeable and who use ride-hailing services, and they're still only paying $155 bucks a month. That's what they're anticipating would be the optimal price. That's about, like I said, 1/3 the cost of a new car payment. So what are we hypothesizing here? Well, what we're thinking is that at this stage of the game, and the way this question was asked, people are not anticipating getting rid of their personal vehicle. Because while a ride-hailing vehicle, be it autonomous or otherwise, can be extremely convenient, especially if you're in an urban area or you deal with traffic and which leads to high stress, it's still not going to be able to take care of you if you need to run immediately, for emergency circumstances, to take your wife to the hospital because she's in labor, or go run to pick up your kid because he's sick or whatever. At this point in time, we're anticipating that people are viewing this $155 as a cost that they're willing to pay in addition to the cost of their current vehicle that they're going to have for personal ownership. And as we saw very early in the presentation, what we think we might see is instead of people having 2 or 3 vehicle households, perhaps they'll drop one of those vehicles and instead say, okay, let's swap it over, have maybe 2 vehicles or 1 vehicle, and then have this autonomous subscription service as well. And one little fun fact, we just said, okay, is there anything else perhaps that might play a part in people's decisions for how much they're willing to pay? And obviously what we found was annual household income plays a major part. For those who have lower household incomes, they just can't imagine paying very much for this service. So, if you're looking at the very, very low end here, people with a household income of between $25,000 and $50,000 a year, their optimal price point is only $105,000. Now, if you jump way up there to $200,000 to $500,000, it goes to $185,000. We didn't put it on the scale because the sample size was too low, but people who had household incomes in excess of $500,000 actually were willing to pay around close to 500 a month for a subscription model. So this goes back and ties into what we said earlier. We anticipate, the future of mobility, people who are going to be using services like this as those who are educated, who live in urban environments, and also those who have high incomes.
Okay.
And with that, Dave, go ahead.
All right, thanks. So that takes us to the top of the hour. Key takeaways here. Ride hailing is really impacting the taxi and limo services out there, and also seems to me making an impact in public transit as well. And maybe expanding the pie a little bit, as well as people who didn't have as many options to get around are now getting around. People do like driving. They just don't want to be hassled with owning a vehicle as much. And the ride sharing with strangers has high and growing barriers to adoption. It points to a need for perhaps a small personal shared vehicles for commuting, so maybe a smaller network of personal shared vehicles. Subscription services, I think, are poised for growth. We can see that growth coming at the high end right now. I think that's probably where it's going to happen, where you have sort of high-end subscription services and maybe low-end ride-hailing maybe is how it's going to shake out. Population drivers for new mobility, young, urban, and those of long commutes. There's a high degree of dissatisfaction with the current sales and ownership model. That's going to change. It's just going to. There's some legal things to address there, but eventually I think we'll push through. And then, as Jason had indicated, there is a lot of fear and anxiety around autonomous, some founded, some unfounded. And so from both the design and service and experience standpoint, there's workarounds there. Things like giving people perceived control that reduces that fear, as we saw in the Otis safety elevator example. Having that human there, even though he doesn't do anything except move a lever, gives people a comfort level that things are getting taken care of, and there's there analogs and autonomous that we can do as well. And then exposure is everything. So getting people to use stuff, even once, it turbocharges adoption. And so getting people to try that first ride hail, try that first subscription, try that first autonomous vehicle, get them in and getting them using it is the absolute key to adoption of anything, really. So the trial works. So with that, we don't have, we're actually over by 5 minutes. We can do some questions now. I know there's a lot of traffic on chat. So if you all have a few minutes to talk, I think James and I and Jason could make some time. And if you have to drop, of course, drop. So I'll just, James, do you want to kind of look at the comments that came in, or should we unmute all?
Sure. I'll take a look, but in the meantime, why don't you sort of start leading some questions for everyone? Maybe unmute everyone. And we'll,
all right. I'm unmuted. So does anyone have...
Não foi estranho de todo o nome, não é?
Não é estranho.
Pois.
Só que eu acho que ele viu aqui durante mais ou
That time gonna work so I can secure that for you.
E depois passou a dar isto ao lado.
Yeah, I don't know if it's gonna work.
You might want to mute
20
it and then
p.m. arriving at 7.
There, that's better. James, let me find you. Yeah.
Why don't we just ask the questions through chat, everyone, and we'll answer them. That's probably the easiest way, is just too much noise coming through.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I'd just like to go to one question here. Would you have a conclusion or clear insight on shared electric mobility in urban cities? Are Americans willing to use just public transport and electric bike, scooters, cars for their last leg to destinations? Yeah, I think that's a good question. This whole question around, first mile, last mile is really, really important. And I think that's one of the areas that, certainly shared mobility and also the future of autonomous ride-hailing services, i.e. the idea of taxi bot is going to become extremely important. And we do see this idea of the CASE platform, connected, autonomous, shared electric, really coming together and really driving off all those functions to create that. And so one of the things that I think will be really important is, as you said, the interaction between public transport and those shared mobility services. And I can just imagine that once a train pulls up from a station, there could be a whole bunch of people who are either live on the same street or one or two streets over that can be reached through an autonomous a shared service, or it could be through a shared bus service like Chariot. So next one here. Question, do you think share car programs will become main seller due to less cost? So I think there's going to be significant growth in over time. One thing that's going to happen is that it's not going to change overnight. It's going to take a while to come in. And I think what we'll see over the next while is different companies and OEMs as well also introducing new services that become much more applicable to people who really don't need to use a car all the time. And I think that's where the growth is. And it's also going to be taking car ownership down. So for instance, in our family, we have 2 cars.